Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
His name was Paul Watson. He was a very tall and big man. People who lived in the Montmartre area of Paris knew him. Paul came to Paris before jazz bands with black musicians were popular. Before this, he was a boxer in his home country. When Joe Gans, a famous boxer, was winning, Paul was also boxing. But Paul didn't fight like Gans. Gans had a special style, but Paul fought like a wild bull, especially if he was fighting a white man. In those days, boxing was rough and people didn't like Paul's wild way of fighting. Because of this, it became hard for Paul to find matches. Paul decided to travel to Paris. He worked on a big ship to pay for his trip. This was before black jazz bands became popular in Paris. At first, Paul found small jobs in Paris. He worked in places where not many people went. He also taught boxing to young men and women. Paul worked hard, so he didn't know much about what was happening in Paris. But over time, trainers and managers began to notice him. They arranged fights for him. Paul won some fights and became a little famous. One day, after a fight, a black man came to Paul's dressing room. He congratulated Paul and invited him to Montmartre to meet other black men living there. Paul made friends with the black men in Montmartre. When the first black jazz band played in a small cafe in Paris, Paul joined them. He played the banjo. For many years, Paul lived a quiet life. His friends often wonder now why nothing bad happened during those years. People knew Paul hated white Americans. After drinking just 2 glasses of Benedictine, he would start talking about how much he hated them. He often said he would fight the first American who called him a bad name. But for 7 years, nothing happened. Later, Paul started working in a bigger cafe with a larger band. This cafe had many American visitors. One night, a drunk man from Kentucky came into the cafe. He walked up to Paul and said, "Hey, brother, what are you doing here?" Paul replied, "It's none of your business. And I'm not your brother. Okay?" The man turned to his friend and said, "Jack, did you hear that black man talk to me like that?" The man from Kentucky turned to speak to his friend. I wish I could have seen what happened next. Everyone tells a different story, but they all agree on one thing. Paul fought about 4 big white men that night. He also broke a lot of furniture in the cafe. Some people say Paul picked up a table and hit people with it. Others say he used a bottle or a chair. No one is sure, but this fight started Paul's anger toward American white people who brought their racist ideas to Paris. Paul became known as the Black Terror. If any white man called him the N-word, Paul would hit him right away. He broke a lot of glasses, chairs, and tables in cafes over the next few years. But people still liked Paul. Maybe that's why the policemen in the area helped him. Somehow, Paul always avoided serious punishment. He usually paid a small fine and was warned to behave better. One night, Paul went too far. In his anger, he shot 2 American sailors. Luckily, they didn't die. Paul wasn't sentenced to death, but he was sent to prison for a long time. In prison, Paul was a sad sight. He sat in the corner of his cell, his big body bent over. He didn't talk much. When he did, he swore about the crackers, a bad word he used for white people. Then the World War began. The war was terrible, with so many people killed. But in a strange way, it also made people more equal. Rich men fought beside poor men. Poets and store workers shared stories. Jews and Christians ate from the same cans of food. During the war, France let prisoners out of jail so they could join the army. Paul was freed and became a French soldier. Because he was strong and brave, he joined the air squad and was honored many times for his courage. When the war ended, Paul was seen as a hero in France. He had a scar on his left cheek and many memories of the war. After the war, Paul returned to his old life. He still hated American white people. Many stories about his fights after the war are still told today. Paul didn't change much. He was still the same Paul Watson walking slowly through Rue Pigalle. Rue Pigalle is a quiet, gray street in the evening. It is like the Harlem of Paris, and many black musicians live near there. These musicians entertain Parisians and visitors. Every day, most of them pass through Rue Pigalle. It's not surprising that people often saw Paul Watson shuffling up Rue Pigalle, going about his day. Paul walked until he reached the corner of Rue de la Bruyère. His feet stopped without him thinking, and he turned into the pit. His full name was the Flea Pit. If you asked a musician why it was called the Flea Pit, they would say it's because all the fleas hang out there. If you didn't understand, they might explain further. Spades, a word some used for black people, were as common there as fleas. For the black musicians in Montmartre, the Flea Pit was a special place. The Flea Pit was a tiny café, the kind of place the French called a bistro. Musicians gathered there in the afternoon to drink Porto or play billiards. After work, around 1 in the morning, cabaret performers and musicians would come for whiskey, soda, or more billiards. Sometimes they ate sandwiches or played quiet games. Over time, it became clear when you could find certain people there. The musicians liked Paul and loved to tease him. They all agreed that Paul was regular, which meant they respected him. Their favorite joke about Paul was that he was tough enough to fight 10 men, but he was scared of women. "Hey, Paul, when are you going to get married?" someone asked. "Don't know. I'm not really into women," Paul replied. "Man, you don't know what you're missing. Paris is full of women who'll whisper sweet things to you." "Not for me," Paul said. "Besides, they're all white. So what? This isn't America. Doesn't matter. I'm black. See? I don't trust white women. If one ever called me the N-word, I'd have to hurt her. Man, you're too old-fashioned. Women here aren't like that. Maybe. But I'm just not interested." Sure. Guys like you always say that. But you'll fall for someone. The tough ones fall the hardest. Paul didn't change. He stayed alone. He drank, smoked, and sat in Montmartre cafes with his friends, but he never spent time with women. One night, after work, Paul was walking in his slow, shuffling way. A woman came up beside him. Voulez-vous, she said, asking if he wanted her company. No, get away from me, Paul said. Oh, you speak English, don't you? Are you an American woman? He asked. I was, before I became a performer and got stuck here in Paris. Well, leave me alone. I don't like your kind. Ah, don't say that, she replied. I'm not prejudiced like some silly women. You don't know who I am, do you? I'm Paul Watson and I hate American white folks. Understand? Paul pushed the woman aside and kept walking alone, but she caught up to him. Her voice was full of tears. Oh, please don't hate me because I'm white and American, she cried. I have no money, and no man will look at me because I'm not dressed up. Now you won't look at me because I'm white. Paul walked faster, but she grabbed his arm and wouldn't let go. He tried to shake her off, but she held on tighter. Paul looked at her thin body, shaking as she cried. Something softened in his heart. Without thinking, he said, All right, I'm not that mean. I'll get you some food. Stop crying. I don't like seeing women cry. Soon, everyone in Montmartre was talking about Paul. Did you hear? Paul Watson takes a woman to Gavarni's every night for dinner. He hardly comes to the flea pit anymore. They teased him. Paul, the woman-hater, has a girlfriend now, and she's white and American, too. See? These guys say they hate white people, but when a blonde woman smiles at them, they forget everything. Paul's going to marry her, you know. He's serious. She didn't want to get married at first, but Paul told her he wouldn't live with a woman unless they were married. She told him all about her past, but he said it didn't matter. He loves her. Well, good luck to him. I don't trust these American women. Everyone was surprised. Paul, once a hero to them, was now just another man in love. On the morning of his wedding day, sunlight fell on Paul's face. He slowly woke up, blinked, and yawned. He smiled, thinking this sunny day was a sign of a happy marriage. He wanted to stay in bed and think about Mary, but he decided to get up and call her to say, Happy wedding day. Paul put on his new gray suit made by an English tailor. He tied his tie and looked in the mirror. The scar on his cheek stood out. Funny, he thought, Mary wants to marry an ugly guy like me. After trying to call Mary for 15 minutes, Paul gave up. He decided to walk to her hotel instead. On the way, he thought about how silly it was to overthink things. In the end, people just do what they want to do. As Paul walked, he noticed mud on his new suit. Why did I choose a gray suit? It doesn't look good on a black man, he thought. Memories of his life came to him. Beating up a white man at the cafe, refusing to live in America where black is black. His thoughts jumped around. Suddenly, he heard the whistle of the subway train. He didn't even remember getting there. He stepped onto the last train car just as it was moving. He looked at his hand. He had a small pink ticket, a first-class ticket, but he was in a second-class car. He laughed to himself. The other passengers stared, but Paul didn't care. First class ticket in second class, he chuckled. Then the memory hit him like a punch. Mary's letter. Her words. I just can't go through with it. White women don't marry black men. She had used him to survive, to get back on her feet. Now, on his wedding day, he was going to wish her happiness, but she didn't want him. Paul sat in the train, lost in his thoughts, while a French woman stared at him. Guess it's the mud, he thought, shaking his head.